Good evening. I would like to start by thanking you guys so much for taking time out of your evening to come, and I'm really excited to share with you my undergraduate senior project. So, my thesis was about Uncle Tom's Cabin and the ways in which Harriet Beecher Stowe kind of misses the mark when it comes to explaining freedom and writing stories of freedom for her characters. So we have to start by understanding what Stowe thinks freedom even is. So this line comes from the mouth of Eliza Harris, a biracial character who escapes slavery and flees to the North with her husband and child. She talks about freedom in a very physical sense: moving, speaking, breathing, going about, and coming in without danger, without facing danger. So Stowe has this very physical understanding of what it means to be free. And my main argument in my project was emancipation is not the same as freedom. And Stowe is really advocating for this physical emancipation. She's not advocating for a freedom where people of color can exist in a primarily white society during the 19th century. So, the ways in which Stowe describes her characters and the ways in which her characters communicate tell us a lot about her understandings of the hierarchy of race. So, she has this very hierarchical understanding of race and belonging in society. So at the very bottom of her hierarchy, we see dark skinned enslaved characters. We see Aunt Chloe and Uncle Tom. We see Dina. We see these characters who are on the outskirts of society and of even the enslaved society, where we see biracial characters and lighter skinned characters having more privileges than darker skinned characters. Eliza is described as having an air of refinement. She is very educated. She lives in the Shelby's house. She has these privileges of going around the house a little more freely, but she's not free. We see Cassie and Emmeline, same kind of thing, lighter skinned characters who are described as being exotic and beautiful, but they are over sexualized. They are seen for their ability to make mistresses for those who enslave them. They are seen as objects, as sexual beings that are used for the pleasure of those who enslave them. Men, we see this kind of same tension, the biggest example being George Harris and Uncle Tom. The way George Harris is described is a very handsome man, a very well spoken man, bit of an anger issue, but overall quite a gentleman, family man. Tom's not described that way. When we are first introduced to him, he's described as being built for work. He's described as this very machine-like physical being that is strong and able to engage in hard labor. We see this in their linguistic capabilities. Like I said, our lighter skinned characters seem to have more eloquence in their speech. Darker skinned characters do not, but they're saying the same things if we listen closely. So, this example I've provided, pages apart, within pages, Aunt Chloe and George Harris boil down the issue of slavery, which is the power dynamic, the very nature and definition of slavery, the ownership of another human being. So George starts us off by saying, my master, who made him my master? This very eloquent proclamation. And then we see Aunt Chloe saying the same sort of thing a couple pages later, but it's lost in this dialect that's hard to understand. And it's kind of brushed over a little more. We don't sit in it as readers as much as we sit in this proclamation of George Harris. We also see it in the ways in which the emancipation stories are told. So the Harris family really escapes to freedom based on their ability to pass as white. So George Harris primarily gets to Canada because he's able to pass as someone of Spanish descent. Eliza has this dramatic flight across the river where she is really stripped of all emotion and becomes this vessel to carry her son. So while Stowe is giving them this physical freedom she describes, she is really stripping away their ability to own who they are and own their heritage. There's this elegant letter that George writes at the end of the story, and he says, I refuse to pass for American. I refuse to subscribe to this society. But that's just it. He's only ever passing. He's never actually given the option to be a part of society. It seems like he is because he's rejecting it, but he would never be able to accept it anyway. Uncle Tom is only able to experience emancipation through death. He is beaten to death at the hands of two other enslaved men on Simon Legree's plantation. And this is Stowe's freedom for him because she cannot imagine a society where he can exist and have the same opportunities as white people or even the Harris family. Now, at the very end on Shelby's plantation, George gives his enslaved people their freedom, but it's not really freedom in Stowe's mind or in Stowe's writing because they choose to stay on the plantation and work and be a part of this system just under a different name. So the power dynamic is still there, but Stowe is framing it as this wonderful move of freedom where it's like we're giving them autonomy. And it's like, you're not. You didn't give them the option to exist in society. You gave them the option to stay. That's the only option she gave them. And it seemed like this, like, duh, we're going to stay, we're going to work. But that's not a common experience of enslaved peoples. And even the Harris family, who escapes, who gets to Canada, eventually goes to Liberia. There is this understanding that African people, people of African descent, can only contribute to society in Africa, in a country where they are at the top of the racial hierarchy, because they are a little more educated, because they are Christian. And there's this disconnect of, hey, you're free in our country, but you're never really going to have opportunities unless you go to Africa. So Topsy, we see the same thing. She is educated by a white woman by the name of Miss Ophelia. She moves to the north of Miss Ophelia. She's educated. She becomes this very gracious, mild-mannered girl with dark skin, but she becomes a missionary in Africa. And she goes to educate and Christianize the people there because she's deemed better than them. She can't exist at the bottom of the racial hierarchy in the United States. So Stowe puts her at the top of another hierarchy across the ocean. So, what are the implications for today, right? So, I threw a lot of information at you, a lot of examples, but so what? This was written in the 19th century. What does it hold for us? I argue that this is the same conversation we're still having in the 21st century. The terminology might just be a little different. I still don't believe that we have equality or equity in this country. And I think we can easily pick out the Elizas, the Georges, the Topsies, who have sort of made it in this country. And we say, well, of course, racism doesn't exist. Look at person A, B, C, and D. They're people of color and they're widely successful. But we can miss the experiences of an entire people if we listen to only the loudest voices. So let's look at art and literature. There is a vast disparity in the representation of people of color in art and literature. Blackface was common. It's still common. It's just not as overt and in your face. Police brutality and culturing, there is still this vast stereotyping. There are still racist organizations that exist today and operate with the understanding that Stowe had of this racial hierarchy. There is still institutional racism. We talk about redlining. We talk about poverty disparities. We talk about injustice in the education system. All of those things were founded in the ideas that Stowe is perpetuating. This power dynamic of who really holds the power, who gets to make the decisions for an entire country. And we see this in the very leisure activities and language we use on an everyday basis. Uncle Tom is still used as a derogatory term for a person of color who doesn't fit the bill of standing up for their people. Peanut gallery, I don't know if you were aware of this, refers to segregated theaters, the black portion of the theater where the people of color were able to sit. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo is a terrible childhood game that is born out of enslavement and born out of racism. So why does this matter? Because we need to read Stowe's work. We can't throw it away. It's problematic at its core, but we need to acknowledge those problems. We need to engage with those problems and interrogate them. Find ways in which Stowe's ideas are both a product of her time and a perpetuation of ideas that still exist in our society today. Only then can we begin to dismantle the systems we have in place today. If we can't find the origin of such problems in our society, how are we ever going to be able to fix them and move on? So, while this all seems very simplistic, it is incredibly complicated, and there are layers to this that we must peel back. But I truly believe it starts with going back to Stowe, going back to works such as these that have missed the mark of what it means to be free, so that we can acknowledge the ways in which our society is still missing the mark of what it means to be free. Thank you.